All right, welcome everyone. And today our resolution will be resolved that the fossil record is better explained by special creation and a global flood a few thousand years ago than by microbe to man evolution over hundreds of millions of years. And today we have Dr. Thomas Seiler and Brenden Kyer, who will be debating the respective sides for this debate. And Thomas, if you could please lead us in an opening prayer.
Yes, of course. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our God, creator of the whole world, creator of ourselves, we ask you to send your blessing upon our debate, upon our words and thoughts, that we will, in a very open manner and with the willingness to listen to each other, exchange the thoughts about the question of time, the question of geology and of the fossils, which is all very much related to where we come from. So we ask you for all the viewers that they will understand the basic arguments, the main arguments, and that we all arrive at the conclusion which is true. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, thank you. And with that, Thomas, you may begin with your 20-minute opening statement, which will begin now.
Mm-hmm. So I will show my slides. Okay, so you can see the full slide.
Yes, we can see that. Great.
So I would like to recall that in the course of this debate, we have seen so far that all living things contain extremely dense and extremely complex information, and all which we know from our experience in nature and in laboratory confirm that information can only come from an intellect and a free will. So we have seen that, for example, the DNA sequences are extremely complex, extremely dense, and that they can even be read in one direction to have a meaning, but also in the opposite direction to have a meaningful, to deliver meaningful instructions. And they can also be read in a way that every so many letters that gives another meaningful set of instructions, or even in another language we obtain meaning. So this is impossible that mutations could arrive in constructing such sequences. Mutations could only degenerate this wonderful code. And furthermore, we have seen that there is no evidence in science that has ever presented one single mutation that added new functional genetic information to the genome of any organism. So if the atheist, materialist, evolutionist account of origins were true, then there should be millions of such examples. And therefore, it is absolutely not plausible, and there's absolutely no mechanism to explain how one kind of organism could have evolved into another, for example, a land mammal into a whale. And moreover, genetics does also not support that the species are connected by common descent. We have often observed that the physical or the phenotype similarity doesn't correlate at all with the genetic similarity. For example, the 5-digit extremities in creatures as different as whales and humans are achieved under the control of totally different genes and by means of different developmental pathways. We have also seen that on the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that show how God, the God of Christianity, brings life from non-life whenever he wills, as in miracles like resurrection miracles of the saints, like the evidence from the Holy Shroud of Turin, from the Eucharistic miracles. So as a bottom line, the burden of proof in this debate rests on the atheist, materialist, evolutionist to demonstrate that the fossil record supports the transformation of one kind of creature into another one through a material process of evolution. And now I would like to continue with presenting the evidence from sedimentology and from the fossil research supporting that the world isn't that old, that the sedimentary rocks aren't billions of years old, and that the fossils do not support development, but rather special creation. First, let us start with the concept of evolution. According to Charles Darwin's own drawing, this tree of life represents the entire idea, the entire concept, as mainly containing that all species have one common descent. So this tree of life, as he called it, is a time axis, has a time axis here on the Y scale, and it goes from today to the past at the bottom. And it basically says that in our time, all the differences which we observe between the different orders, classes, families, and kinds, they become smaller as we go deeper in time, as we go back in time, but also as we go deeper in the geological column, since the sedimentary strata are also interpreted as a succession of time, with the top layers being the youngest ones and the bottom layers the oldest ones. So we should just see a reflection of this decreasing similarity in the fossil record. Another important feature of the concept of evolution is that this change in time was a continuous one, a stepwise change by small mutations accumulated over hundreds of millions of years, and of course driven by the mechanism of selection, of survival of the fittest. And furthermore, during this process of stepwise development, new organs and functions were introduced by natural processes, not by any divine supernatural interaction. That's the theory of evolution. And of course, the theistic evolution would introduce a divine guidance here, but that's not the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution says it's only by natural processes, and that's what we are debating here. That's the only thing which we find in the textbooks and in the science books, not theistic concepts, a guided evolution. I would like now to talk about the paleontological evidence. We see here a typical example of a sedimentary strata formation, which is extended over many miles. And even such sedimentary rock formations, such layers, they range over continents. And as just indicated, the succession of the strata, of these parallel strata, is associated with a succession in time. Older strata at the bottom and the younger at the top. And they contain millions of very well preserved fossils. And here we come already to an important observation when we compare with today. When a creature dies, fossilization is extremely rare, because all biological creatures, when they are dying, they are eaten up by bacteria. And it's very unexpected to find millions of such well-preserved creatures in the rocks. So already here we can doubt the standard principle of uniformitarianism, which states that the present is the key to the past. Obviously, that's not the case. The present doesn't show fossilization, but in the past there was a lot of that. An important feature of the geological formations is that the appearance of the different classes of animals and of man has a certain order. And this is usually considered as a very important argument in favor of the theory of evolution. Shelled animals start to be found already in the Cambrian period, in the Cambrian layers, supposedly around 500 million years old. And they are found in all layers up to the youngest ones, up to today. Fishes start to appear in higher layers, then amphibians, and then reptiles, mammals, birds, and finally humans. So this seems to tell a story of life, a story of development, with different creatures appearing later in time. Let us examine whether this is a correct interpretation. As already told, the Tree of Life, painted by Charles Darwin here, also reflects what we should see in the fossil record. We should see that the fossils which we dig out in the top layers and are in the next deeper layers more similar to each other. The deeper we are going, the more similar all classes, orders, families, and kinds should become to each other, until at the very deepest layer we only find one organism. But what do we actually observe? Let us now look into paleontological data sheets. I give just a few examples. Here is the fossil record observation at the example of subgroups of mammals, rapid-likes, rodents, primates, bats, insectivores, whales, predators, and so on, through the geological column from Pleistocene to Paleocene, or even Cretaceous. What we observe here is that these different kinds, these different families, they do not change their morphology throughout their layers in which they are found. We see, and this is indicated by the width of these lines, that the number of variations or races varies with the depth. They can become more or less wherever we dig them out. But we do not observe that their basic construction plan changes over millions, tens of millions of years. The predators that we find on top, they stay the same until they disappear in the fossil record, supposedly some 50 million years ago. The whales, which we dig out today, which we find today, they stay the same and do not vary in the very past to become something different. That all should be the case if these creatures were related to each other, if they had a common ancestor. Then we would expect that at deeper layers, they show convergence, but they don't. I continue with just another example with crabs. The different families of crabs, they show the same pattern. And even up to the time period of the Devon, 416 million years, supposedly, all these different families do not converge. The dotted lines show what we should observe in the fossil record if evolution were true. But we don't see this, we see only these full lines wherever we are looking. The same is true for the tribolites, the same is true for the millipedes and for the insects. They don't become more similar to each other in the past. Even over hundreds of millions of years, they don't do that. The same holds for the spiders. We could continue with many such charts, and here just a last one, which is on a higher level, that's for different orders of animals, like the birds, the mammals, the reptiles, the amphibians, the bony fishes, the cartilaginous fishes. They also, over hundreds of millions of years, in their basic construction plan don't change. They don't become more and more similar to each other in the past. So this is an extremely strong argument against evolution. If the geological column, and this is a standard interpretation, is really hundreds of millions of years old, and the bottom layer is the very old one, and the top layer a young one, then this history book, if you want to call it like that, testifies for stasis and not for evolution. I just show some images of animals which we know today in the fossilized state with a supposed very high age. This scorpion shows all features of modern day scorpions. No trace of some simpler structure, something in development. Everything of this high-tech structure is already fully formed in the fossils. The same we see here for this fossilized crab. For the plants here in the fossilized state and today, no trace of evolution can ever be found. Of course, we see that some creatures are extinct, like the dinosaurs, which have in the past been called dragons. They were all known to mankind, but we don't see these gradual changes, and that's needed for evolution. So we see marine creatures, we see the same pattern for the fishes, we see this for the crocodiles. In summary, evolutionist Niles Eldredge, in the Pattern of Evolution from 1998, admitted it is a simple, ineluctable truth that virtually all members of the biota remain basically stable, with minor fluctuations throughout their durations. And Mark Ridley, a student of Richard Dawkins in New Scientist, in any case, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. And this is perfectly true, because the fossil record is evidence for special creation. And now I would like to use the remaining time for my opening statement in an excursus on what we know today from university research, from laboratory research on how sedimentary strata actually form. The theory of strata formation, which is still predominant, is that of Charles Lyell, which in turn goes back even to the theory of Steno, in the Nicholas Steno in the 17th century. And it goes like this, that water covered the earth, water stood still, and in this still standing water, sedimentary particles slowly settled down, the water withdrew, and the sediments hardened into rocks. At a later time, water covered again the earth, and the next layer of sediments settled down, the water withdrew and hardened into rocks. And this repeated itself over hundreds of millions of years. The basic assumption in all that is that the water doesn't move. There's no water current. And this is the major error of this theory, because scientists like Guy Berthaud or Jürgen Schieber have done flume experiments in US laboratories. I recommend to go to this website, www.sedimentology.fr, where you can see videos of these flume experiments where water was circulated in small rivers, and the water contained sediments. And it was observed that when water moves, a totally different mechanism of deposition applies. The particles, they are depositing not from top to bottom slowly, but rapidly with the moving water. And during this movement, they even sort themselves according to size, shape, and density. That's why we get these parallel strata that we observe in nature. And so this is a result from their flume experiments. They obtained self-sorted layers of sediments of different shape, different size, different density of the particles. And this is obtained in laboratory time very rapidly. So the basic law which they discovered is that when water moves over the surface of the Earth, then water erodes the surface, and by this erosion, the water takes up sedimentary particles. And the faster the water flows, the higher is the capacity to take up particles. And as soon as the water slows down, this capacity to carry these particles goes down. And slowing water then therefore means that the particles fall down, they deposit, and by depositing, according to what we have just seen here, they sort themselves. Now, there's very much evidence that it was this mechanism in nature which was happening and which was in action, and not the mechanism of suggested by Charles Lyell and Nicolas Steno. This is one of these evidences. Polystrate fossils, like this tree trunk ranging through several successive layers. It's very implausible that the sediments covered this lower part of the tree and it stood upright for millions of years until it was completely covered. It's more likely that this laboratory mechanism applied here. And we observed such depositions in the recent eruption, the catastrophe of Mount St. Helens, where upright tree trunks were completely covered by sediments, not over millions of years. Here is another proof that the deposition must have happened rapidly. Bent strata. It must have been soft when it was bent because there are no cracks inside. And most important, we see no irregularities between the strata, while here on top we see a lot of irregularities. So no erosion. How can that be over millions of years that wind and weather would not work on that? But here today, they easily change the structure of the surface. The next layer to be deposited would no longer be as parallel as here. So this clearly confirms that it must have happened very rapidly, this deposition, and therefore there is no evolution in the fossil record. We also know that there are things in the strata to be found, like in the dinosaur bones, which have no chance to survive for millions of years, like soft tissue, blood vessels, blood cells, proteins, and even sequenceable DNA in dinosaur bones. Therefore, and here just to show this image, this was found in dinosaur bones, preserved structures in deep strata, very unlikely that blood cells could survive for 65 million years. So the geological column is better interpreted in terms of 1 to a few thousand of years. Most of it must have been in one big catastrophe. Perhaps there have also been some smaller local floods, but it was a very recent event. And then the succession of the appearance of the different kinds of the different classes is better explained by the sequence, is better explained by the habitat where these creatures live. The closer to the ocean floor, the deeper they are buried. So with that, I conclude and leave the time for Brenden's opening statement.
All right, thank you for that opening statement. So Brenden, your 20-minute opening statement begins now.
Yeah, so one of the things that we have to agree upon when we come into any sort of debate is an assumption of good faith argumentation. Right? We have to assume that our opponent is going to be taking us in good faith. Otherwise, the point of the debate is ultimately pointless. I confess my belief in this good faith from y'all's side grows ever thinner as you continue to say the same exact things and I give the same exact answers and those answers are ignored and the things are said. No, none of what you said in the beginning was actually demonstrated. None of it is true. I very clearly demonstrated that and provided a plethora of studies, which it sounds were not read, demonstrating that yes, mutations create new information. Yes, mutations are not necessarily harmful, don't necessarily degrade the code. Really what's going on here is it seems as if y'all don't understand what evolution is at all. You just don't understand evolution, right? Evolution is just the process of change of allele frequency over time. that allele frequency, that those changes over time can be incredibly minor. It can be incredibly large, and it is exactly what we see when one parent gives birth to another to another child, a member of its species, and that child is not a clone. There are genetic differences. That is all that evolution is. You can try and divide, say, micro and macro evolution, but if you want to do that within the actual scientific terms, that is just the difference between, like, I believe it's like speciation and everything else. So with that in mind, addressing the fossil record, the very first major issue you come across when you want to address the fossil record is the great preponderance of fossils. It is a logical fallacy to see how many fossils we have and then assume that we must ignore, say, principles of uniformity because we have a lot of fossils and we don't see fossils made very often now. That is begging the question. That is assuming the creationist timeline and then assuming that Noah's flood must have happened because it's the only thing to explain the number of fossils according to the creationist timeline. But we in fact are not assuming that. We are assuming a vast preponderance of time in which 99% of all animal life dies and is not in fact fossilized. But given the amount of time that we have, we get the amount of fossils that we have. One of the examples of this that proves to be incredibly damning to the young Earth ideology is chalk. So chalk is the composition of massive amounts of fossilized plankton and other small and even microscopic sea animals. We have so much of this chalk, in fact, that if all of that sea life lived in a 6,000 to 10,000 year time frame, Adam and Eve would have been walking through the garden with like knee-high sludge from the amount of plankton, algae, and other such biomass that would have been covering the earth. Like, there is no way that amount of sea life lived in that short of a time span. And we can extend that to the vast amount of fossils we have across the board, especially when we include things like coal and oil, which are, we know, the results of fossilized and decomposed animal carcasses, especially like dinosaurs. You cannot account for the amount of life that we know existed within a flood narrative timeframe. But even that aside, the main point I want to focus on, well, a quick side point, the pictures that were demonstrated to try and show that, well, there has been no change in those particular animals over time. If you go and you actually look at those fossil specimens, there's great research comparing the fossilized versions and what we have now and demonstrating the changes over time. But yes, some species have managed to prove survival of the fittest is just, you are the fittest thing to survive in your environment. If there is no catastrophic change to your environment and you are well fit for the environment, then you'll be able to survive for a really long time. But what he didn't show, and unfortunately I don't have a slideshow prepared today, I'll try and put one together and follow up with a separate video demonstrating some of this. But what he didn't show is the massive amounts of very complete records. My personal favorite is the whale. If you go and you look at the whale evolution, we have incredibly clear and incredibly obvious and an incredibly complete list of skeletons demonstrating whale evolution from a land-dwelling mammal to what we have as whales today. It is, I mean, if you want to talk about like common sense, you just look at them side by side and it's pretty obvious. Yeah, yep, they are related. Very easy to see how those changes just add up over time in ways that do very clearly demonstrate those changes over time. But what I really, really want to focus on is the fundamental problem of this question, like, at all. Right. So the way that these debates are usually addressed. These debates usually, the creationist is targeting the problems in the evolutionist viewpoint, or the evolutionary viewpoint as they see it. And it's a creationist attacks, evolution proponent defends, and that's kind of where it lands. And it makes it sound as if there's an equal worldview on the other side that is a counter. I'm not going to do that. What I want to focus on is the fact that this is not actually a debate between someone who believes in young Earth creation and disbelieves in evolution, and someone who believes in evolution to the exclusion of young Earth creation. We both believe in evolution. And actually, I'll take it a step further. The young Earth creationist believes in a hyper evolution. They believe in an evolution that is so incredibly unbelievable that it defies all studies and all logic. See, according to the young Earth creationists, the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. According to Thomas specifically, who is a Catholic, Noah's flood occurred, which, by the way, just quick side note, running water deposits sediment by weight, doesn't just deposit it willy-nilly. We have heavier, denser rock layers on top of lighter, less dense ones, instantly disproving your claim that Noah's flood would have laid down the sedimentary levels, but or the rock layers. But that aside, if we include Noah's flood, we're talking about 4,000 years, right? We have about 4,000 years to take a small ship, a boat of animals, and create the vast diversity of life that we have today, let alone the vaster diversity of life that we have in the fossil record, right? Noah's Ark is a very, very small bottleneck in which two dog-like creatures then have to go and propagate and become the amount of species that we have in the world today, which just based off of a quick Google search is, let's see, how many species do we have in the world today? 1.7 million species classified. It says so far, so not necessarily today. Looks like there's higher numbers. Yeah, a lot. We have a ton of species. We have a massive amount of biodiversity just alive today. Add into that the amount of biodiversity that we know has gone extinct since 4,000 years ago, and add into that the amount of diversity we have all over the world. And what Thomas is claiming is that this mass of biodiversity, this preponderance of creatures, that this writhing mass of biomass across the world in all of its complexities and in all of its differences evolved in a mere 4,000 year time frame. Even if we give Thomas the Noah's Ark, put whatever animals he can fit on a boat that size, it's not many, but whatever animals you want to fit on there, this is absolutely preposterous. We do not see speciation to this extent. I think a scientist did a breakdown of the numbers, and it was something like we'd see something like 15 new species every day. I will see if I can find that study and include it in the citations. But it is an absurd. Apologies. But it's an absurd amount that you would have to involve, right? So this is not actually a debate about whether or not evolution is the best answer for the fossil record. And evolution is just it changed in allele frequency. It's just changes over time in populations. We know that that happens, right? Microevolution is what the creationists usually call it, but we know that these changes happen. What we are, in fact, talking about is one side claiming that the entirety of the over a million species that we have alive today, plus any undiscovered, plus all of the ones in the fossil record, that this enormous amount of diversity somehow happened in 4,000 years from two animals of their quote unquote kind, which is an incredibly vague term that we actually don't know anything about, biblically speaking. And that somehow those two populated and had mutations that changed at such a rate that we get the diversity that we have in life in the world today from that, and that we do so without any evidence of these animals in any sort of like migratory paths on the way to where they'll end up, right? So for instance, we like the platypus is an incredibly unique animal. We don't have platypus fossils going from Mount Ararat to Australia. These things are in Australia, right? Most of the animals in Australia seem to have developed independently of the rest of the evolutionary models due to their isolation in regards to the rest of the world, right? We have a ton of incredibly unique animals in Australia. We have no fossils demonstrating that they walked there from Mount Ararat. We have, furthermore, no evidence of these animals deciding to go anywhere other than Australia. We don't have platypi in North America, right? It seems like they got off the ark and then walked in a single direction until they got to Australia and then settled down there, and then they died and started leaving fossils and such. What is funny is we do have like fossil evidence demonstrating animals that are like the animals that we have in places today in like less developed forms. We do have fun things as well, as like the dinosaurs. See if the fossil record, if Noah's flood were true, then heavy animals would sink to the bottom, because that's what happens when you mix things up in water and then let the water settle. Heavy things sink to the bottom, light things float on top. And yet what we see in the geological column is a consistent development from lighter and simpler animals to more complex animals, because that's what evolution says is happening, is that we go from simplicity to complexity. And then suddenly we have, after the time of the dinosaurs, they go extinct, and things, it seems, almost like revert to a level of simplicity. Or at least, sorry, decrease in size. I'll say that. They decrease in size. And then we see things develop again towards what we have today. Coincidentally, by the way, if you want to talk about like geology, which this was fossil record, not necessarily just how rock layers are made, but there is a specific rock layer around the Earth that is composed, it's a very thin rock layer. It is Earth-wide, and it's composed of a very specific mineral that is incredibly rare to find here on Earth, is incredibly common to find in asteroids, demonstrating that an asteroid impact hit. And that is actually a line, if you go and you look, it is after that rock layer, we see dinosaurs starting to become less and less common and then eventually dying out. Right, we have all of these things. We even have answers for things like polystrata fossils. That's not a tree. That is a type of, I can't remember the word for it right now, but it's more like the weeds that you get in your yard. If you go and you look at some of those weeds, how they have the like circular trunk that is hollow in the middle. It's one of those. They just used to be really, really big. They're incredibly resilient, and they lived in places where you had regular flooding seasons. We can see from observing the records of these fossils that what happens is the tides, the flooding brought in earth layers, laid it down, it hardened hardens as the tide recedes, brings another one, and because of the nature of what this fossil is, what the nature of this plant is, it's more resilient than trees are. It's already grown tall, and the layers of earth are able to just kind of build up until it eventually dies and is covered over. Like, we know how all of this happened because we can go and study it. In fact, there are massive amounts of studies on these things, and this is what gets really, really frustrating when trying to address some of these issues. If these are genuine questions, if there are genuinely questions about, well, how can we have these polystrata fossils? Rather than simply going and telling people, there are questions about this, therefore the creationist model must be correct, you could instead go and you can find the research done on all of these things, because every single claim that gets brought up has an answer. Scholars, scientists, people who are much more intelligent than me and who spend their lives devoted to these topics have done the research and have demonstrated very clearly how these things happen. Instead of dealing with that, right, instead of going and finding those answers, these claims of, well, look at this looks like, therefore it must be, right? These claims of, well, just use your common sense, get thrown out as reasons why we should doubt the evolutionary model, but they're straw men. They're not actually addressing actual issues, right? Again, if we were dealing with actual issues here, we would be addressing things like, well, how does then the creationist model, this high amount of speciation, occur when that's just not how we see speciation occur today? Instead, we get claims about how some levels of rock are formed differently than other levels of rock, as if scientists don't know that. But yes, we know a volcanic eruption is obviously going to lay obviously going to lay new rock layers. It's going to lay very specific type of rock layers. And when we are going through the geologic column, we can actually identify when a rock layer is caused suddenly, catastrophically, especially by something like a volcano. In fact, there's very interesting research on a massive volcano, and I want to say it's around where like Russia is today, like an enormous volcanic eruption that covered something like, oh, what was it? It was like the size of Europe in lava field. I don't quote me on that specifically. I'd have to go and double check the details, but like, we know these things happen. We can account for them. The problem is that we also know how to date volcanic rock, because we can go to Mount St. Helens, and after it's cooled and it has like ceased its chemical reactions and has gone into a state of just decomposition with the radioactive materials, we can do tests and we can find that, oh, hey, we can date the rock at Mount St. Helens. We can date the rock at Pompeii from Vesuvius. But then somehow creationists want us to believe that although we can date, say, the rock at Pompeii, I saw a study that dated the rock from the Vesuvius eruption within, I think it was like a year of the year we know it actually happened. Instead of, it's, yes, perfectly accurate. Oh my goodness, look. And then when you apply the exact same methodology to volcanic rock layers, and you get dates of millions of years, suddenly the science is called into question, the findings are ignored, and we just clearly can't trust that, even though it's the same methodology. And the only reason that's given as to why we should trust the one and then just ignore the other is because, well, they're bringing their worldviews into this. It's no question of the methodology. Methodology is not actually able to be confronted. It is, in fact, just a question of the worldview, because it doesn't come to the answer that you're wanting. And with that, I will conclude.
All right, thank you for that opening statement. And now we will have each side give a 10-minute rebuttal. So Thomas, your 10-minute rebuttal will begin now.
So I would like to comment first on the important argument which Brenden, you raised about 4,000 years not being enough time to produce the biodiversity which we observe today, and that today we apparently only observe 15 new species, whatever we define as species here, as per day. From from breeding research, it is well known that it's very easy to get very much diversity in a few hundred years, or even in decades only, and that also nature, like here, the guppies or tilapias in Lake Victoria, they can produce new races, or if you want to call it species, when they are reproductively isolated, in a very short time. And now all these race formation processes, they can even bring advantages, again, resistance against pesticides, herbicides. That's all observed. And the point to understand these phenomena, and from there to conclude whether the 4,000 years are enough or not to produce the diversity we observe today, the important starting point is to think about the mechanism of race formation. And here I want to do it at the example of some concrete variable population, let's say the wolves, and you take, or an insect, whatever. The first step of race formation is always isolation. All these different colors represent different alleles, and by isolating a subpopulation, the frequency of certain alleles is not necessarily the same average allele frequency as in the original one. And then if these subpopulations, which are isolated, for example, due to some catastrophic events, an island breaking away from the continent, that will lead to inbreeding. And inbreeding, of course, is a harmful process, leading to a further random loss of genes. And then in the end, if they stabilize, they form new races only by genetic drift. But the important thing is all this genetic information has already been there in the beginning. And the key to form new phenotypes is simply to isolate them. And isolation can happen very quickly, especially if an Earth is completely empty after a global flood. Noah's Ark was well big enough, it has been calculated, that it could accommodate the basic types of each creature. Of course, not every breed of dog would fit on the Ark, not an adult Tyrannosaurus, not an adult elephant, but you have the basic types of the reptiles, of the different groups of mammals, and so on and so on. And when they leave the Ark and they settle everywhere on the Earth, they are isolated, and this leads to an extremely rapid formation of biodiversity, much faster than today. And commenting on the argument about the sedimentary rocks, which is so essential, I agree with Brenden that such phenomena of upright fossils are not a proof that all the geologic column was let down in one catastrophe. Certainly, it could well be that a catastrophic event, as you mentioned, Brenden, of a volcanic eruption could be enough to produce these sediments to cover plants, whatever plants, in an upright position. So the argument I wanted to bring with this slide is only that this mechanism, which we know from laboratory, actually works. It is present in nature. There can hardly be any doubt about it. The question is now only, and there we, of course, we differ so far, that whether this rapid strata formation mechanism was locally only, in some special events, some special catastrophic events, or whether it produced the entire or almost the entire geologic column. And in order to argue for the last scenario, well, this huge formation is already pointing in that direction, but still not a proof for the entire column. This, however, is a proof, in my opinion, because each rock formation, no matter in which country, no matter to which geological period or so-called period it belongs, they all show the same pattern of no erosion or irregularities from layer to layer. Of course, there are some minor fractions or something like that, but not what we would need to have if the present were the key to the past. Because here you see the present, these irregularities everywhere on the Earth's surface. Just some quotations from the scientific literature. A puzzling characteristic of the Earthen boundaries and of other major stratigraphic boundaries is the general lack of physical evidence of subaerial exposure. Traces of deep leaching, score, channeling, and residual gravels tend to be lacking, even when the underlying rocks are dirty limestones. Or Nyberg and Howell in the journal Geology, they found out, they reported that 84% of Earth's land surface today is being eroded away. Now, if 84% is eroded away, and we have the same kind of creatures today as we have in the past, I just showed all these paleontological data charts. How can it be that today 84 is eroded away and in the past it was never the case? How could such a different nature have been in the past with still keeping the same construction plans of all these classes and families and types of animals? And here another quotation from the Earth magazine. These coal seams run remarkably thick and unsullied by other material, usually unwanted sediments, such as clay, washes over a deposit before coal seams can get very thick. This leaves scientists with the baffling question of how the seams get so massive and still remain undiluted by influxes of clay and other impurities before they thicken. So in sum, this testifies for a rapid deposition of the entire geologic column. And together with the findings of soft tissue in deep layers as those attributed to dinosaurs 65 million years ago, supposedly, these structures, you just have to Google for Mary Schweitzer and you will find her publications. And these structures of flexible tissue, which still can, like a rubber, be pulled apart and it will retain its original form. These strongly confirm that the time axis here is not over millions of years. And also DNA, which is found here, DNA has a half-life of 500 years, roughly. It's very implausible that it should last for 65 million years. Therefore, Guy Berthaud summarized in Lithology and Mineral Resources the dating principles determined in the 17th century by Steenon, an anatomy professor of Copenhagen University, upon which the geological timescale is founded, should be re-examined and supplemented. So therefore, I would like to leave it with that. Maybe one last comment. Brenden, you said that the time is enough to explain this huge amount of fossils, this huge number of fossils. Well, that would be true if the fossils were uniformly distributed and not, as we observe them, very concentrated. We find fossil yards where there are so dense assemblies of dinosaurs, for example, that it's not just an accumulation of time which brought them together. It must have been a catastrophic event. But agreed, this only testifies for one catastrophic event, not for the entire geologic column, whereas the missing erosion, in my opinion, is the key, and the findings of biostructure, of soft tissue and DNA and other biomolecules in deep strata. So that would be my closing on this.
All right, and Brenden, your 10-minute rebuttal will begin now.
So first of all, I grow increasingly more frustrated every time y'all bring up Mary Schweitzer. She has very explicitly said she does not want young Earth creationists misrepresenting her work to try and twist it to fit their worldview. She is a Christian. She has very actively done a lot of research on on these dinosaur bones. There's been a lot of research done on the soft tissue found. And I would implore that before you use her name in a public debate again, you go and you read the research that has been done that very clearly explains how the soft tissue has survived, because it's very robust. There have been plenty of experiments that have been done since then to demonstrate that. In fact, it turns out that first, the parts of the soft tissue that survived are the hardiest parts. You do not have any of the actual like easy first to break down pieces of tissue. You only have things that are hardy and long lasting. And then specifically, it is those that when exposed to iron have been demonstrated in the lab to be able to last exponentially longer than regular decomposition rates. They've explained why they have soft tissue in these dinosaur fossils. And it is not because these fossils are less than 1,000,000 years old. And Mary Schweitzer has gone on record multiple times asking y'all to stop abusing her work because y'all don't understand it. So I would very politely ask that you honor her wishes and stop trying to bring up her name when you don't understand her work. Secondly, yes, so it turns out that for a fossil to be made, fossils aren't just made every day. For a fossil to be made, you have to have the skeleton or the bone or whatever is going to be fossilized covered, generally in some form that is going to protect it both from predators and from normal decomposition and from the elements. And then it has to remain in that way with certain elemental conditions for a long enough period of time that it solidifies it as a fossil. Those conditions necessarily are going to mean that most of the fossils that we have are going to be created by some level of catastrophe. The problem is we have layers, we have massive rock layers with varying types of catastrophes that aren't going to fit together with this idea that there's just one catastrophe, which was Noah's flood, right? If a bunch of animals are buried by a flood, we can tell, right? If they died due to, say, water and drowning, if they were covered by mud, we can tell. If then above that, several rock layers later, we have more fossils, and those fossils are buried in a different way, in a different style, that makes things look really, really odd. It's very odd that we can have one disaster create multiple types of fossils in the same area from multiple different types of disasters. More specifically, if we see that flood layers laid down and then solidified, creating a group of fossils. And then above that, we also have a demonstration that more floodwaters came laid down and solidified. There is not enough time in your single geologic disaster of Noah's flood for water to lay down the sediment, recede enough to solidify, and then return to lay down more sediment later. There's not enough time for that in Noah's flood. That's not how rock works. It takes time for wet rock to dry, harden, solidify, and then for the water to come back, such as in that polystrata fossil that you demonstrate, or that you showed, right? That is a fossil that was created by multiple seasons of flooding. And we know this because you can go and you can observe things like the mineral contents of the soil and things like that. And then on top of that, yes, we do have massive graveyards. We would expect this under both models, sure. But what we would expect to find under the creationist model is that in these massive graveyards of animals, we have all sorts of different types of animals from different eras, different time periods, right? Things that defy the geological column. You would expect that you would find, say, a T-Rex in the middle of devouring a human with, I don't know, something pre-Jurassic, like something older than it, in the same level. Well, we don't see that. In fact, we see in these graveyards that the animals that we would expect to be alive during the period when, during that layer, we find alive during that layer. In fact, our predictive powers of this have gotten so good that, number one, our entire oil industry depends on this. Our oil industry worldwide depends on evolution being true, because that's how they know what layer of rock and in what areas to drill for oil. We would not have an oil industry the way we have it today if evolution weren't false. Or sorry, weren't true, if evolution were false. It just wouldn't exist. It couldn't. Because we would just be having to guess every time and hope that we find pockets of oil instead of being able to accurately know what regions to look for oil in, what depths to go to, things like that. Similarly, so one of the most famous fossils in the fossil record is Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik is one of the most famous fossils, not just because it is a phenomenal transitionary form that puts to death any claims that we don't have fossils of something in process from one type of creature to another. But most importantly, Tiktaalik is fascinating because we looked at what we had in the fossil record and we went, hey, there should be a creature that is like somewhere between entirely land, entirely sea, right? Some sort of creature that's in between, that's going to look kind of similar to these things that we have over here, kind of similar to these things we had before. We should be able to find it based off of where we know from the geologic column, where we know like what kind of temperature, what kind of climate this would have lived in. Based off of what we know about the rock layers and the time and when this would have taken place, we should be able to find this type of creature. Don't know what it looks like, but we should be able to find something like this in this region. And then by golly, we went and dug and found it. Science predicted, because this is what science does. You form a hypothesis based off of the available data. You test your hypothesis, and then you evaluate whether the findings confirm or deny your hypothesis. We had a hypothesis based off of the very, very clear amount of evolutionary data we have. They tested the hypothesis by going and digging in the spot that they expected to find a particular thing based off of all of the data that they know, and they found the thing. So is that a just massive coincidence? Well, that seems incredibly unlikely since they've been able to do it quite a bit since. It also seems incredibly unlikely again since the entire oil industry is based off of that exact principle. And with that, I think, oh no, I have like 2 more minutes. And then just a very quick response. So yes, if you throw just a small population into an area for long enough, with inbreeding and all that, yes, you start to create some levels of species, and we know that through that we can create a high number of species relatively quickly. That doesn't explain the amount of diversity that we have across the world. It doesn't explain how certain animals develop in certain regions across the world, similar to others on the other side of the world, even though we know that there was no crossover between the continents before a really long time ago, right? Like this, it does not explain your 4,000 year problem. Sure, if we kept all of the populations in isolation for long enough, maybe we could create that number, which, by the way, I am being very generous. We are not talking about the failed attempts at speciation because the animals were not fit for life and thus, or not fit for the climate, the area that they're in, and thus die, which surely must have happened to at least some of the species from the Ark, right? Penguins aren't going to survive very long in the Judean desert. Right, but this, yeah, it in no way actually fixes your issue. And bringing up fish just then brings up the other issue of mixing fresh and salt water being a massive Like mixing fresh and salt water would kill the entirety of the fish population, or most of it. And yet somehow Noah's Ark, the entire world floods, and both freshwater and saltwater animals manage to survive just fine. Yeah, that's not how nature works, right? Like the Noah's Ark story, the amount of the amount of strange credulity is just like so utterly insane that it is not viable as a scientific theory. The most you can do is say that this is all miraculous. God just snapped his fingers and made it happen anyways. He did the flood and then recreated life on Australia, recreated life across the world. Also happened to do so, making it look like it followed this thing that we can study, observe, and reproduce, but didn't actually follow that thing because that would have required too much time. Yeah, the entire story is just a bunch of nonsensical myths. It cannot work. It does not work. And it has been demonstrated over and over again in every field that there is no plausible way to make it work.
All right, so now we will have each side give 1 5-minute rebuttal, and then we will have a 5-minute closing statement for each side. So Thomas, your 5-minute rebuttal begins now.
All right. I would first, 1 second, I quote Mary Schweitzer because she was mentioned here. Now, Mary Schweitzer is not the only one who found such things in fossils supposedly millions of years old. And actually, these things are not just the hard parts that survived so long, according to this timescale, but proteins like collagen, keratin, hemoglobin. This is very sensitive to, especially to the chemicals which are around. DNA in water dissolves very rapidly, so it's unlikely that it can survive for such a long time. And the point I want to stress here is that even if Mary Schweitzer says she doesn't want that her work is used for an interpretation of a young Earth, that is her personal opinion. To her belongs the honor to have found all these things. That's very good scientific work, observational work. But she has not the right to interpret it she has not the only right to interpret it. Everyone else in the world has the right to do that. And it's not impolite if an interpretation differs from Mary Schweitzer's interpretation. Now, Brenden, you mentioned that the time was not enough to deposit all these layers, but I would again recommend to watch these videos where you see that these strata form rapidly in laboratory time in a current which flows. And now you also again clearly agreed, that's fine, with that we had at least many catastrophes to explain many features in the geological column. So if there were many catastrophes and not just one big, as I argue, I ask why these many catastrophes did not leave many traces of erosion everywhere in the geological column. Why don't we see such intermediate structures like this surface and then another continuation with parallel ones? So that's not very plausible. Now, coming to the point of the intermediates which are suggested, I would like to quickly talk about the whale which were mentioned. So this is in here. Now, a typical very famous sketch of the alleged or the supposed whale evolution from mammals, land-living mammals, to sea-dwelling mammals like this Basilosaurus is shown here. And over the sequence from Mesonychids to Ambulocetus and Rhodocetus, the whales should have evolved. And however, there are numerous problems with this. For example, the Ambulocetus which is in a very important position between land and water-dwelling animals. This creature, as Bertha wrote in Science, in 1994, since the pelvic girdle is not preserved, there is no direct evidence in Ambulocetus for a connection between the hind limbs and the actual skeleton. This hinders interpretations of locomotion in this animal, since many of the muscles that support and move the hind limb originate on the pelvis. So this is not a real genuine representation of what has been found in the fossils. And another problem with such representations, Ambulocetus is only 7 feet long, Rhodocetus only 9 feet, while Basilosaurus is 50 to 70 feet long. If it had been rescaled properly, it would be much more implausible that the sequence were true. And finally, the dating of these supposed intermediates shows overlapping ages. They have lived at the same time, at least for 500,000 years, and therefore they can't be candidates for the necessary intermediates, because an intermediate doesn't just mean that we find somewhere here, like for example this line, a creature coming up which has features of both orders, like for example living on the land and living in the sea, like an amphibian. What we need is a continuous convergence, that they become more and more similar, and Tiktaalik is just not enough to account for that. That must always be kept in mind, the entire picture. And with that, I think my time is probably over. So
Yes,
thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So now, Brenden, your 5-minute rebuttal begins now.
Yeah, so first with Mary Schweitzer, very, very specifically, I said, not that people aren't able to make an interpretation of her work, but that you don't understand her work. Okay, the issue that I have and the issue she has is you don't actually understand her work. You are taking very broad strokes, like clickbait headline articles, types of information about her work, and then ignoring all of the details and all of the massive amounts of work that have been done by her and others since then to demonstrate very, very clearly plausible and possible ways that happened without creation, without it being a young Earth. My issue is not that you're talking about Mary Schweitzer and she asked you not to. No, it's that you don't understand her work, and you are continuing to add ignorance into the world by muddying the waters, by presenting her work in ways that is not actually representative of her work. You are actively making this dialogue harder to have because you are coming across as someone who knows what you're talking about, and you don't. You do not know what her work says. Because if you did, you would know that she has already demonstrated, as have others, what process took place to preserve the soft tissue in the time frame that the evolutionary model presents. This is not evidence for creation because it's been shown how this would happen in the time frame presented. That aside, so goodness, this is one of the big issues that I have every time I try and talk about fossils, especially. So what you showed for the whale evolution was a very overly simplified and cartoonish drawing of 4 different creatures. And then you presented a quote from 1994. Since 1994, we've found massive amounts of fossils. The things said in 1994 are not necessarily representative of the things now. Please find more modern sources. Secondly, we don't just have 4. We have, in fact, a massive lineage. We can see massive amounts of detail in this evolution. We can see things like from fossil to fossil across time. We see the nose, the blowhole move from the front of the snout up the skull as it becomes advantageous to do so. We see sizes change. We see the flippers go from having fingers to having still finger bones. Like they're still finger bones in whales, even though whales have flippers. It makes no sense from a design perspective. It's just unnecessary, and also not like any of the other sea-based creatures. But it makes total sense if you follow these skeletons backwards in time. Let me think. Yes, there is a great preponderance of these. There are tons and tons of these. We have species all throughout. We have far more than was presented, and we have more recent information than 1994. The chart that you have on the screen with the fossil record observation itself is also a problem, right? Like, to say that, well, this shows that there were predators, and look, like, it's not changed that there were predators since this time. Okay, but those predators have changed, right? The nature of the predators, the ways that they hunt their prey, the ways they appear, what they look like. I mean, they're still in the process of changing, right? Like, to just say that, well, this shows that predators have remained the same. No, it shows that there have been predators. They've grown and shrunk, but it doesn't have any specificity as to like, what predators? What do these predators look like? What kinds of predators? So that chart, the fossil record observation chart, doesn't demonstrate what you're trying to make it demonstrate. And then finally, the rock layers. Yes, you can demonstrate. You can do this at home. Go and put some go and get like a big jar and put some soil in it, add some water, shake it up real good, and the soil is going to settle. It'll settle in layers. Here's the problem. It settles in layers according to weight. That's not what we see in the geologic column. If Noah's flood happened, the geologic column would have settled according to weight. That's not what we see. Therefore, the strata could not have been laid down by a flood. Furthermore, quite a few water laying down rock layers is only one of the ways that rock layers are formed. There are other ways, including things like volcanic eruptions, and there's lots of other ways for rock layers to form that aren't flood-based, and in fact can't really occur during a flood. Volcanic eruptions, for instance, a volcano erupting underground is going to create some small localized rock layers. We have massive lava fields that would have required eruptions over massive amounts of time, and then would have required more time for those lava fields to cool. We don't see this myth of uniform like layers sorted by rock weight any more than we see fossil layers sorted by fossil weight. If a flood created the fossils, we would see very clearly that there would be patterns in the fossils that demonstrated a flood. We would see predators and prey mixed together. We would see attempts to scurry for like high ground where everything is buried together. We would see overall, as the turbulent waters mix all of these animals together, that it would settle heavy at the bottom and light at top. These are not things we see. The geologic column does not demonstrate at all that there was a worldwide flood. In fact, it demonstrates consistently the opposite. And again, this is not even to mention the rock layer of meteorite, which wasn't addressed, which is you can't lay that down by a flood. That is created by a meteorite hitting Earth that it was large enough that it laid down this like virtually worldwide single layer in the same place of this particular mineral, separating, by the way, two periods. There's a period before the asteroid and there's a period after the asteroid. This was not done by a flood. It couldn't have been done. It is just not only is it like improbable, it is nonsensical.
All right, so Thomas, you have an extra 3 minutes, so you may have 8 minutes now for your final closing statements.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Now I guess I have said already all I wanted to say. I just maybe what could I add? I'm thinking about it. Which would add anything new? I mean, to me, it would be a repetition of what I already said. I have not seen these mentioned series, which would then enter into these data charts, leading to convergence, leading to changes. So that still holds. There are a few candidates like Tiktaalik, we have heard, which are isolated, but which don't suffice to show the convergence. So they are not something to demonstrate evolution. And yeah, that's the main point. And the missing erosion is still the most important thing, even if there are layers of rock where something is in between, which is interpreted as an asteroid. It needed to be shown that the surface where this object is, unfortunately, I'm not very well informed about it. Maybe I'm wrong now what I'm saying, but it would have to be determined whether the surface boundary between the two eras are free from erosion or they are very irregular. And I'm convinced that they are completely free from erosion. They are parallel like all the others. And furthermore, that's the last comment. The sediments are of course not deposited in the mechanism that Charles Lyell suggested, so that we could account for heavier objects being in a certain position or lighter being in another position, because that's still water. The sorting happens in a current. That's important. And then it's not a matter of weight of fossils, of weight of particles. It's a matter of their shape, of their density, and of where they have been eroded away and where they have been deposited again. So this experiment that was suggested that I could do at home is useless, because that will not produce these strata as we found in the Flume experiments. That's real science. Let's look at this, and even repeat it at home would be too much, certainly for all of us, but to watch this video. Then that's all I want to say, and say thank again. Yeah.
Okay, and also I was wondering if for the last maybe for like 3 or 4 minutes, could you comment on the fossil record for the evolution of man from apes? Because science has supposedly shown how there are different that there's like a progression from an ape-like creature, and then there's like 3 or 4 different steps to man. And can you comment on that fossil evidence?
Right. So can you see this image actually? Or is it?
Yes, I can see that one.
It's visible. Okay. So yeah, of course, there was a lot of research in a missing link between the common ancestor of apes and man, and the candidates which have been proposed, like this Neanderthal man, they could all be either put into the category of real ape or real man. Like I just now comment on the Neanderthals. This representation, which was considered a scientific one, was based on a wrong reconstruction by Marceline Boule, a French paleontologist. And 50 years later, a re-examination was done, and Scientific American summarized, Boule and others were mistaken. Neanderthals were not less human than modern man. It is now clear that the Neanderthals had the same postural abilities, manual dexterity and range and character of movement that modern man do. So this is not only for, and here another comment from Wolpow, a leading researcher in this subject. Neanderthals have much larger brow ridges than living Europeans, and they are always continuously developed across the forehead. But a significant number of recent and living indigenous Aboriginal Australians have large, continuously developed brow ridges. Does this make them more primitive than Europeans? Does this make the Neanderthals modern? Of course. So it shows that Neanderthals are just in the range of today's humans. They are humans 100%, as we all in the world are 100% human, no matter how large our brow ridges are or not, or what color we have, or what size, or what nose, or these are just minor differences. And therefore, the same is true for all the other candidates like Homo erectus, which falls completely in the range of modern days variations.
Okay, great, thank you. So Brenden, you have a little over 2 minutes for, well, you can go for maybe 3 or 4 minutes for your closing statement.
Yeah, so I think that the human evolution is an excellent example of the biggest problem that I have had progressively through these debates. Y'all either don't know what evolution is, you don't know what it's saying, you don't know what the scholarship is saying, you are just utterly ignorant as to the what is actually being said, or you're being dishonest and misrepresenting them in order to make them look farcical. There is no in between. The studies on Neanderthals show that yes, the upper edge of Neanderthals' brow ridge corresponds with the lower edge of humans. That's the overlap. Some on one extreme have similar numbers to some on the other extreme. The problem is that we are talking extremes on both sides. We are not talking the norm. The norm is still nowhere close to humans. The average is just not there. So you're either misrepresenting the science or you just don't know the science. I'm not sure which, but giving you the benefit of the doubt, just saying that you just don't know. There is so much literature on human evolution. It is so well mapped out, so well understood. We have full genomes for some of these. The young Earth creationist account cannot account for things like foramen magnum, the place where the spine meets the skull. Right, there are very clear human ancestors or human species ancestors where that is down like humans, so that they are very clearly walking upright, even though you would look at the rest of their anatomy and you would say it looks much more like a chimp. These sorts of things are incredibly prevalent. We have tons and tons of research on this. And to point to misinformation, right, things that are just wrong, as evidence that we don't know this information, especially in isolation. We're talking even if you were correct. Okay, cool. So sure, even if that was true of Neanderthals who were similar enough to us that we were able to actually breed with them, even if that were true with Neanderthals, you're still not accounting for the mass amounts of other human ancestors that we have, of the things like Homo habilis, you have Homo erectus, you have Australopithecus afarensis. The list goes on and on. If you want more information on this, Gutsick Gibbon is probably my favorite as far as her vast comprehensive knowledge of human evolution. But there are so many resources on this that for you to not know this is just absurd, right? This information is known. You're trying to make arguments for things as if these haven't already been proven. They have. You're wrong. This is not true. Yeah, so sorry, I didn't mean to spend all of the time on human evolution there, but I do feel like it is such a good example of the problems here. All of these things that keep being brought up are issues that have already been addressed. That's why your quotations are from the 1990s or earlier. These things have been addressed. We know how these things work. We also know how the young Earth creationist model couldn't work. All of this has been demonstrated in the literature, and the literature is not being addressed by y'all in these debates. So I conclude.
All right. And Thomas, you have an extra 3 minutes or so. Do you have any final remarks that you'd like to make, or would you like to conclude here?
Yeah, just to say that the Australopithecines, they are, so all the candidates which Brenden mentioned, like Homo erectus, Homo Pilton man, he didn't mention, but that was a very famous one, a famous fraud, although the New York Times considered this a proof for Darwin's theory. So Neanderthal is not the only wrong information that was given to the public. Nebraska man is a similar one based on one single tooth. They made up this story, and now it has been disproved. So what I'm doing is really quoting the scientific literature. The same is true on Ramapithecus. You can look at this that disproves, that rejects Ramapithecus as being an intermediate. So all of them have been rejected by the real scientific literature. And the Australopithecines, they are a group of real apes and not humans. Oxnard is one that was leading in this science, and in this table is summarized that indeed the Australopithecines have man-like properties, like the position of the hip joints, but they have a lot of ape-like properties, and they have properties which are unique for them. But we have to consider the overall morphology, and that's of an extinct ape. And furthermore, there's no simultaneous stratigraphic sequence of all properties going towards man. Therefore, it's true what we see in the scientific literature and in many such quotations, that Australopithecines do not deliver proof for evolution.
All right, thank you. So with that will conclude our debate. So Thomas, could you please lead us in a closing prayer?
Yeah. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We thank you, God Almighty, our Creator, for this debate, for this open exchange, for this fair debate where we were all given a fair amount of time and we respected each other's right to express his opinion, and that we had the opportunity to see the wonders of your creation. And we beg you to depart in a peaceful way, of course, and with all these thoughts, still thinking about them, and that you may guide us always on the way of truth. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right, thank you. And hope you have a good day. And Thomas over in Germany, hope you have a good night.
Yeah, thank you both. Goodbye.
All right. Okay, bye.
Thanks. Bye.